It started off as one of those strange things you don't think much about at first. A new habit that pops up unexpectedly but doesn't set off any red flags. My wife, Laura, had always been organized. She liked routines and order. That's part of what made her so good at her job as an accountant. I've known her to be methodical in almost everything, from grocery lists to vacation planning. But lately, something seemed off about her habits. It started with our evening TV routine. Laura used to unwind by watching 1 or 2 episodes of a show before bed, usually something light. We'd settle into our couch, share a blanket, and by the time the second episode ended, she'd already be drifting off. But a few weeks ago, she switched from her usual sitcoms to watching news broadcasts. The more morbid, the better. At first, I chalked it up to curiosity. I mean, who doesn't get morbidly curious now and then? But the kind of news she gravitated toward was different. Stories of brutal murders, serial killers, missing people. She didn't just watch them. She absorbed them, her gaze fixed and intense. I noticed that she started staying up later than usual, searching for obscure crime documentaries and reading every article she could find on unsolved cases. She even began subscribing to a couple of true crime podcasts. It was out of character, but it wasn't something I felt worried about. Not yet, at least. The real turning point was the whiteboard. One day, I came home from work to find a large whiteboard mounted on the wall of our study. There were rows of neat handwriting, a few pictures, and colored markers littered around. It looked like something straight out of a detective's office. I had to stare at it for a good few minutes before I realized what I was looking at. A timeline of real-life crimes. "Laura, what's this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice casual as I stepped closer. My eyes traced the names of victims, locations, dates, and details. "Just something I'm working on," she said, not looking up from her notebook. Her tone was light, almost dismissive, but I caught the way her fingers twitched as she flipped the page. It was the smallest sign of unease, almost imperceptible. "Are you researching a case?" I tried to sound intrigued, not alarmed. She shrugged. "It's a hobby, like putting a puzzle together." She looked up then, a faint smile on her lips, but her eyes, they were dark, hollow almost. "I like to see if I can connect things others have missed." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded and walked away. I tried to convince myself it was harmless. Maybe it was a phase. But the board grew over the next few days. More lines connected names and places, more pictures of crime scenes taped up. It wasn't just a curiosity anymore. It was obsessive. I mentioned it a couple of times, jokingly at first. "Are you secretly working for the FBI now?" I laughed, but Laura barely reacted. Then, one night, as I turned off the living room lights, I found her in the study again. It was well past midnight, and she hadn't even noticed me come in. She was standing so close to the board that her breath fogged up the pictures as she whispered to herself. I leaned closer to catch what she was saying, but the words didn't make sense. "They missed it. It's right there. It's so obvious." I cleared my throat softly, and she jumped. I'll never forget the look she gave me, like I was the intruder. Her expression softened almost immediately, but for a split second, I'd seen something raw, almost primal, in her eyes. "Hey, you should get some sleep," I murmured. "You'll burn yourself out." She smiled, a strained sort of smile. "Just a little longer." By this point, I was getting worried. I'd wake up to find her side of the bed empty more often than not. Sometimes, I'd hear her in the study, muttering under her breath, shuffling papers. But it wasn't until the incident with the trash bags that I really started to panic. It was a Saturday morning. I'd gone out to take the trash to the curb and noticed the bin was heavier than usual. I opened it up, curious, and found 3 thick black garbage bags wedged inside. They were heavy, almost bursting at the seams. I frowned, tugged one open, and felt a cold chill run through me as I saw what was inside. Papers, hundreds of them. Old notebooks, crumpled drafts, printouts from online forums. There were pictures, too. Crime scene photos, mugshots, clippings from newspapers. All of it centered around the same theme: unsolved murders. When I brought it up to Laura, she brushed it off. "Just cleaning up some old research," she said with a dismissive wave. But the thing was, I hadn't seen half of what I found in that trash in our study before. It was like she'd been hiding it, or hoarding it. "Why throw it away?" I pressed gently. "I'm done with that case," she replied, her tone so flat it sent a shiver down my spine. "Moving on to something else." And she did move on to something more unsettling. That night, I went back to the study after Laura had gone to bed. I don't know what I was looking for. Some kind of explanation, maybe. But I didn't expect to find a new board. A much smaller one, hidden behind the door. This one didn't have names of victims or crime scenes. It had photos of people I knew. My boss, my co-workers, the woman who worked at the bakery down the street, our neighbors. And in the very center was a picture of me. My own face circled in red. My first instinct was to call out to her, demand an explanation. But then I realized, what would I even say? What could I say? I stood there, staring at my own picture pinned like a target. The red circle around my face looked almost alive in the dim light of the study, throbbing with some kind of twisted energy. My pulse thundered in my ears as I backed out of the room, quietly shutting the door. I felt like I'd just stepped over an invisible line, and there was no turning back now. The person sleeping in my bed, was that really Laura? The woman I'd shared my life with for the past 10 years? Or was it someone else? Someone unrecognizable, hiding beneath her skin? I went through the next few days in a fog, pretending everything was fine. Pretending I didn't know that something was very, very wrong. I started staying later at work, using meetings and projects as excuses. At night, I would lie awake, listening to the creak of the floorboards as Laura wandered around the house. Sometimes, I'd hear her whispering again, but I couldn't make out the words. It was like she was speaking to someone else, or maybe something else. Then, one morning, I woke up to find Laura already gone. It was unusual. She always woke up after me. My heart raced as I padded downstairs, checking the study, the kitchen. No sign of her. Just as I reached for my phone, the front door opened, and she stepped in, her face flushed from the cold. "Morning," she chirped, almost too cheerfully. I went for a run. I blinked. A run. Laura hated running. She'd always joked that if anyone ever saw her jogging, they should call the police because something was seriously wrong. But there she was, dressed in new workout gear, hair tied back, a light sheen of sweat glistening on her forehead. "Yeah, thought I'd try something new." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Maybe you should join me sometime." I forced a laugh. "Sure, maybe," but I knew I wouldn't. I knew I needed to keep my distance, keep observing. Laura's behavior was growing more erratic, but she was also becoming smarter. I caught her glancing at me out of the corner of her eye, studying me the way she used to study those crime reports. Whenever I tried to get a look at her research, she'd quickly minimize the screen or cover her notes. I started keeping a journal, jotting down every little thing that seemed out of place. I didn't trust myself to remember all of it. Her sudden silences when I walked into the room. The way she'd ask strange, pointed questions. What would you do if you found out someone you loved had a secret? Or how far would you go to protect someone, even if they did something terrible? At work, I started using my lunch break to look up psychiatrists and private investigators. But something kept stopping me from making the call. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was guilt. After all, what would I even tell them? But then, Laura made it easier for me. One night, I came home to find her sitting at the dining table, waiting for me. There was something on the table in front of her. A small, square object wrapped in brown paper. "Sit down," she said softly. My throat tightened, but I did as she asked. The chair creaked as I lowered myself onto it. I stared at the package, my pulse hammering in my ears. "What's this?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Open it." My fingers trembled as I peeled away the paper. The contents were unexpected, just a small, leather-bound notebook. It looked old, the kind you'd find in an antique shop or someone's attic. My brow furrowed as I opened it, scanning the first few pages. They were filled with messy, cramped handwriting, the ink faded and blotchy. "It's a journal," Laura murmured. "I found it a few weeks ago. It belonged to someone named John Miller. Do you know that name?" I shook my head slowly. "No, should I?" She leaned forward, eyes gleaming in the low light. John Miller was suspected of killing 5 people in 1978. All women. They never proved it, though. He vanished before they could bring him in. This is his private journal. I swallowed hard, the weight of the notebook suddenly heavier in my hands. "Where did you get this?" "It doesn't matter." She brushed off the question like it was unimportant. "What matters is what's in it." I flipped through the pages, skimming fragments of thoughts, scribbled rants, and chilling descriptions. It was like stepping inside a mind unraveling in slow motion. He'd written about the women, about watching them, planning, hunting. He'd even drawn crude maps and diagrams. But what caught my attention was a single, scrawled phrase repeated over and over again on one page. Asterisk, "The pattern is in the blood. The blood tells the truth." Asterisk. My skin crawled as I looked up at Laura. She was watching me with an intensity that made my stomach turn. "Why are you showing me this?" I whispered. "Because I think there's more to it. There are patterns in here, clues. And I think," her voice dropped to a whisper, "I think I found a link between Miller and the other cases I've been studying." The room seemed to tilt. "You're not seriously, Laura, this guy was a serial killer. Are you saying you're trying to, what? Solve his murders?" She shook her head slowly, almost pityingly, like I was missing something obvious. "No, not solve. Understand. I think John Miller knew something big. And I think there are others just like him who are still out there." My mouth went dry. "Others? Killers," she murmured, her eyes alight with a fervor that sent a chill down my spine. "I'm close to figuring out their pattern. If I can crack it, I'll know what they're going to do next, who they'll target." "This is insane," I breathed. "You're not." "Am I?" She leaned back, crossing her arms. "I know it sounds crazy, but look at the notebook. Really look at it. There's something there. Something the police missed." I know I'm right. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to tear the notebook in half, throw it in the fireplace, and pretend none of this had ever happened. But a smaller, darker part of me was curious. What if she was onto something? What if she really had found a pattern, some kind of thread connecting these cases? But another thought crept in, unbidden and unwelcome. What if she was just Losing her mind? The question lingered as I stared at the twisted scrawl on the page. The blood tells the truth. And suddenly, I realized it wasn't Laura I was afraid of anymore. It was what she might find. I wish I could say I threw the journal away, that I stormed out of the house and demanded Laura get help, that I drew a line and stuck to it. But I didn't, couldn't. Instead, I read it. For the next few nights, I'd stay up late after Laura went to bed, poring over Miller's journal. At first, it was just morbid curiosity, an attempt to understand what had possessed my wife to become so obsessed. But as I read, something shifted. Miller's words, his frantic scribbles, and the strange, coded messages hidden between the lines all started to gnaw at my mind. There were detailed descriptions of locations, seemingly random numbers, and symbols scrawled in the margins. One phrase kept repeating, though written over and over, sometimes in the middle of other sentences like an uncontrollable tick. The mirror reflects the pattern. I couldn't make sense of it. But then again, how could I? I wasn't a detective, just a regular guy trying to keep his marriage intact. Yet I found myself falling down the same rabbit hole Laura had. I'd trace his routes on Google Maps, cross-reference old newspaper clippings, even reach out to obscure online forums where amateur sleuths debated cold cases. Every path led nowhere. But Laura was different. She never seemed frustrated, never seemed lost. It was as if she were following a trail only she could see. Then one night, I woke up to find her side of the bed empty again. I wasn't surprised, just resigned. But something made me get up and follow her this time. Maybe it was the way the house felt. Too quiet, too still. I crept downstairs, expecting to find her in the study, but the light was off. She wasn't in the kitchen or the living room either. Panic bubbled up in my chest. Where the hell was she? And then I saw it, the faintest glow of light coming from the basement. I hesitated. We almost never used the basement. It was just a cluttered storage space filled with old boxes and broken appliances. Laura hated it down there, always saying it gave her the creeps. But I could see her silhouette at the bottom of the stairs, unmoving, like a shadow etched into the darkness. "Laura?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't turn around. My skin prickled as I made my way down, the wooden steps creaking beneath my weight. The closer I got, the more I could hear it. A soft scratching noise, like nails against wood. And then I saw what she was doing. She was hunched over a patch of the basement wall, a knife in her hand, carving into the plaster. "Laura!" I hissed louder this time. She froze, shoulders stiffening. Slowly, she turned to face me, her eyes wide and wild in the half-light. For a moment, I thought she was going to lunge at me, knife and all. But then she blinked, the tension bleeding out of her as if she hadn't recognized me at first. "What are you doing?" I whispered, my voice trembling. She looked down at the knife, as if just noticing it herself. I don't know." Her voice was small, uncertain, so unlike the Laura I knew. I reached out, gently prying the knife from her fingers. My gaze shifted to the wall behind her, and my breath caught in my throat. There, etched into the plaster, was one of Miller's symbols. A crude, uneven circle with a cross through it. It looked like some kind of twisted sigil, the grooves deep and jagged. "What is this?" I demanded softly. "Why are you carving this?" "I don't know," she murmured again, almost helplessly. "I just felt like I had to, like I needed to see if it was there." "What do you mean, if it was there?" She shook her head, tears brimming in her eyes. "I can't explain it. But when I was reading Miller's journal, something about this symbol, it felt important. I felt like I needed to put it here, like it would make something click. I stared at her, my heart hammering. "Laura, you're scaring me." She laughed then, a short, brittle sound. "I'm scaring you? I'm scaring myself, David. It's like I'm not alone in my head anymore." Her words hung between us, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to grab her, shake her, tell her to snap out of it. But I didn't. I just wrapped my arms around her, holding her tight as she shook. "It's okay," I murmured. "We'll figure this out. You need to get some rest, okay?" She nodded numbly, letting me guide her back upstairs. But as I tucked her into bed, I knew sleep wouldn't come for either of us. The next morning I called out of work. Laura seemed better, calmer, almost as if the events of the previous night had been erased from her memory. But I couldn't shake the image of that symbol, etched deep into our basement wall. I spent hours researching it, combing through forums and articles, even reaching out to a few contacts I'd made in the online true crime community. Nobody recognized it, except for one person. It was around midday when I got the email. A reply from an old message board thread I'd posted in years ago about some minor crime story. The username was unfamiliar, just a random string of numbers and letters, but the subject line made my heart skip a beat. I know the symbol. With trembling hands, I clicked it open. There was no greeting, no introduction, just a single line of text. Asterisk, the circle with the cross is called the Watcher's Mark. It's a sign used by certain groups to track their own asterisk. My eyes widened as I read the next sentence. "If she's drawing it, you need to get out." My hand hovered over the mouse, paralyzed. I read the message over and over, hoping it was some kind of sick joke. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The symbol in the basement, the name, asterisk, the Watcher's Mark star. Laura had carved it into our wall like it was nothing. And that message, "If she's drawing it, you need to get out." Get out? Leave my wife. I shut the laptop and tried to catch my breath. Maybe I was blowing things out of proportion. Maybe Laura was just having a breakdown, and I was letting some anonymous internet weirdo make me paranoid. But a cold, creeping sensation in my gut told me the truth. Something was very, very wrong. I wasn't sure if it was with her or with us, but I couldn't just walk away without knowing more. I knew I needed to confront Laura, but I couldn't do it directly. I had to be careful, deliberate. That evening, I waited until she was out running again, something that had now become a daily ritual, and went back down to the basement. The symbol was still there, as jagged and eerie as before. But there was something else, too. Something I hadn't noticed the night before. The floor around the wall was different. As I crouched down, I saw faint scuff marks, like the kind furniture leaves when it's dragged across the ground. My pulse quickened. I pushed the boxes and old storage bins aside, revealing a small door in the wall, one I hadn't even known existed. It was old, set low to the ground, almost hidden by the piles of junk. My hands shook as I tugged it open. The smell hit me first, earthy and stale like damp soil, and then I saw it. A narrow tunnel, sloping downward into darkness. I didn't want to go in. Every instinct screamed at me to shut the door, put everything back, and pretend I'd never found it. But I needed answers. I needed to understand what was happening to Laura, what she'd been doing down here. I grabbed a flashlight and hesitantly crawled inside. The tunnel was cramped and claustrophobic, barely wide enough to move through. I don't know how long I followed it, maybe a few minutes, maybe longer. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the dark. Finally, I reached the end, where it opened up into a small, roughly dug chamber. What I saw inside made my blood run cold. There were pictures, hundreds of them, pinned to the dirt walls. Pictures of me. Some recent, some from years ago. Photos of me at work, at the grocery store, asleep in bed. There were even a few from when I was a teenager, ones I didn't even know existed. And it wasn't just me. There were pictures of Laura, too. But they looked different. In some, her face was blank, eyes vacant, like she wasn't really there. In others, she was smiling, but it wasn't her smile. It was too wide, too sharp, like she was mimicking an emotion she didn't really feel. My heart pounded as I stepped closer, and then I saw the worst of it. Pinned in the center of all the photos was another symbol, larger and more elaborate. It was the same as the one she'd carved in the basement, but with more detail. Additional lines, dots, and runes radiating outward. And in the middle, in stark, bold letters, was a name. David. My name. Written again and again in different scripts and styles. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. What the hell was this? Was this some kind of sick joke? Some twisted obsession? But before I could process it, I heard something. Footsteps. Coming from the tunnel behind me. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. There was nowhere to hide. I pressed myself against the dirt wall, barely daring to breathe, as the footsteps grew louder and louder. Then a figure emerged from the tunnel. It was Laura. She stood there, bathed in the harsh beam of my flashlight, her expression unreadable. The light made her eyes look sunken, hollow. "What are you doing down here, David?" she asked softly. I found the tunnel," I stammered, backing up against the wall. "Laura, what is all this? What's happening to you?" But she didn't answer. She just took a step closer, and that's when I saw it. The knife in her hand. The same one she'd used to carve the symbol in the basement. "Laura, put the knife down," I whispered, trying to keep my voice steady. "We can talk about this. Just put it down." But she shook her head slowly, almost sadly. "You shouldn't have come down here." "Why?" I demanded, my voice rising. "What's going on?" "Because," she murmured, her gaze drifting to the pictures on the wall, to the twisted symbol with my name at its center. "You were never supposed to see this. I was supposed to protect you. But now it's too late." "Too late for what?" She took another step closer, and in that moment, something snapped inside me. I lunged, grabbing for her wrist. The knife clattered to the ground as we struggled, her strength surprising me. She fought like a wild animal, clawing and kicking, but I managed to pin her down, panting and shaking as I held her wrists above her head. "Laura, stop it!" I shouted, desperation tearing at my voice. "What's wrong with you? Just tell me." Tears filled her eyes. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I didn't want you to get hurt, David. I was trying to keep you safe. But they know. They know you're onto them." "Who?" I demanded. "Who knows?" But before she could answer, her gaze shifted, focusing on something behind me. My grip loosened, and she went still, her eyes widening with horror. "They're here," she whispered. I turned slowly, my heart hammering. The tunnel was empty, but there was a sound, a faint, shuffling noise, coming from the darkness beyond. A cold dread washed over me as I realized we weren't alone. "Run," Laura breathed, her voice barely audible. "David, you have to run." But I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, staring into the darkness, paralyzed by fear. And then, slowly, something began to emerge from the tunnel. I never saw its face. Just a shape, tall, gaunt, with limbs too long and thin to be human. Its silhouette loomed in the shadows, watching us. I could feel its gaze, cold and sharp, cutting through the darkness. And then, with a soft, raspy voice, it whispered, "Found you." My blood turned to ice. I scrambled back, dragging Laura with me. But the thing stepped forward, its presence filling the tiny chamber. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I knew was that I had to get out. "Go," Laura gasped, shoving me toward the tunnel. Go. I didn't hesitate. I ran, half crawling, half stumbling through the narrow passage, the walls closing in around me. I could hear it behind me, the sound of something scraping against the dirt, following me. Laura's screams echoed through the tunnel, but I didn't stop. Couldn't. I burst out into the basement, slamming the door shut behind me. I pushed boxes and shelves against it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The house was silent, too silent. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. And then, a voice drifted up from the basement, low and guttural. "We'll be watching." I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, ran out the door, and didn't look back. #epilogue. I don't know what happened to Laura. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, the basement was empty. No tunnel, no symbols, nothing. It was like the whole thing had been erased. I left the house that night. I stayed with a friend, then moved out of town. I tried to put it behind me, tried to forget. But sometimes, late at night, I feel it. Someone watching me, eyes boring into my back. And every time I turn around, I see it. That symbol, the Watcher's mark. It's been carved into my front door, etched into the sidewalk outside my office, even scrawled on my bathroom mirror in red ink. They're still watching. And I'm afraid that, one day, I'll find out what they're waiting for.